In this portion of our Worldviews and Values class, we're now going to turn to two works by a very important 19th century German philosopher, Karl Marx. Now, Marx is better known for his work in economics and political theory and sociology than he is as a philosopher to many people. And to those who might be a little off-put at having to study Marx, we're looking at two documents that are relatively early in his career, and we're looking at them in a philosophical way. We want to understand how he fits into some of the key themes that we've been looking at the entire term, namely the understanding of human nature, of society, and of the underlying reality that encompasses both of those. So Marx has a lot to say about those in these works, and as usual, what we want to keep in mind as we're approaching them are the three key elements of genre, what kind of work we're dealing with, historical context, and then the main themes. All of these interpenetrate each other and influence each other, so we're going to treat each one of these in turn. We're looking at two different works here, although they're overlapping in content to some degree, so we really have two different genres at work. Now, one of the works, translated as Estranged or Alienated Labor, is actually a set of notes. The other work, the Communist Manifesto, is exactly what it says, a manifesto. So let's think about these two different kinds of genres and what they tell us about how we should read these works. So Alienated Labor, or Estranged Labor, depending on how you want to translate Entfremdung, is a manuscript from 1844. And it's one of these things that later on, Marx didn't publish in his lifetime, it's published within the Soviet Union by some scholars in the 1920s, and it's published among a bunch of other economic and political manuscripts. And these are sketches, for the most part, that Marx was working on after he finished his graduate education and as he is trying to figure out, where to go with things. So he is using some of the philosophical ideas that he's come into contact with, particularly that of Hegelian philosophy turned in a particular way. He's turning his attention to human economic life and to what he can see going on in front of him and to history and to what we call political economy. And he's reflecting on these. Now, the notes are in some respects fragmentary. You notice that it actually will say at the very end of this piece, the manuscript leaves off here. That's because that's where he quit writing. Large parts of it are quite worked out and developed, but they're not what we would expect to see in a completely final form. So you might say that this is not necessarily a first draft, but a second draft or third draft, but it is a draft. So you want to keep that in mind as you're approaching it. There is some really coherent thought there. There's some really central ideas in talking about the modes of alienation, but we'll get to that in a moment. The other work, the Communist Manifesto, it's kind of at the other end of the scale as far as its polished nature. It is a finished work. As a matter of fact, it's intended not just as sort of notes to a scholar who's working on some ideas by himself, but for a completely public audience. When you write a manifesto, what you're doing is you're making public your particular perspective. And it's a perspective, in this case, on human beings, on class struggle, on economics, on politics, on what should be done, on who's doing it the right way, on who's not doing it the right way. A lot of things are rolled into there. So what they aim to do in this is make a sort of coherent exposition or argument about what it is that the communists are all about. So they're presenting their core doctrines, they're presenting some of their key concepts, they're making some arguments, and it's for a group called the Communist League. Now that one's co-written. Marx collaborates with a guy named Friedrich Engels, who he became friends with, and would collaborate on a lot of other works with as well. It's intended to provide an articulation of their basic ideas in a very clear form. It's not intended to provide all of the supporting argumentation or exposition. It's supposed to go boom, 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 and take you through the whole thing. It's also intended to reach an audience that is not just an educated elite, but the people at the other end of the scale, the proletariat, who it's supposed to be addressing. When Marx and Engels at the end say, the workers should unite, he's talking directly to the workers. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And he's also addressing other socialists and saying, here's how you guys are getting things wrong. He's also talking to the workers and saying, hey, don't go after these guys. They're not doing something that's actually going to make your lives better. We have the blueprint. So now both of these, I should point out, are actually early works. The Alienated Labor manuscript is from 1844, and the Communist Manifesto is from 1848. So these are both from the 40s. It's actually written before the great uprisings of 1848, which forced Marx and Engels to revise a little bit of what they had to say about German or true socialism in the third part. Now, as you're reading these for this class, in the form that I've presented them to you, you should read all of Alienated Labor. It's very short. It's pretty concise. It's pretty clear in its moving from point to point to point. The document that I'm providing you with for the Communist Manifesto, just read the manifesto. This thing is often packaged with a whole bunch of other things like prefaces and letters, and you can even get it with Marxist catechism or communist catechism. And you don't really need to read all of that extra stuff in order to appreciate what is going on in the manifesto. The manifesto is already dense enough. It's got 3 main parts, each of which is kind of its own separate treatise that you want to work through. So I would say just focus on that portion. So these are the things to keep in mind as far as genre as you're approaching these works. We've got sort of unfinished notes on the one hand, and we have a public declaration of what this movement is all about on the other hand. It's interesting to think about historical context for these works, because not only was so much going on, but the 19th century, if you want to sum up philosophical ideas, and this is a little bit risky, but if you want to sum them up in one word, it would be history. Philosophers were becoming very conscious of what we call the historical dimension of human existence. The fact that, not only does development take place, but our consciousness changes over time depending on the epoch that we're in, depending on how politics works in that time, depending on the economic development, the activity, the new things that are brought into being. So Marx and Engels are deliberately focusing on the historical development up until their own time. You might say that they're interpreters of their own present moment. So that's something you want to keep in mind as far as historical context. Now let's think about what was actually going on at the time and what had preceded this so as to lead to the kind of things that Marx was writing. So front and center, we have to talk about the development of modern industrial society. And when we're thinking about that, there's really 3 main countries that were, you might say, leading the charge on that. And that would be Britain, the United States, and France. Industrial development was most, well worked out in those countries. And there's a whole story there that could be told, but that would take up too much time about why in those areas. Germany also had some important industrial development going on as well. But as we're going to talk about, it hadn't progressed as far, and the class structure was somewhat different in Germany than it was in post-revolutionary France or in England that was becoming dominated by the bourgeoisie, or in America. So, what happens in the development of modern industrial society? Well, one of the key things that differentiates industrial society from a manufacturing society is that machines are taking over wider and wider areas of production. So human beings had been harnessing the power of machines since the ancient period. We have levers, water wheels, all sorts of things like that. But the industrial age sees this very accelerated progress, creating things like steamboats, creating things like much better artillery. Took a terrible toll during the Civil War because they weren't quite adjusting for it yet. Creating medicines, creating dyes, creating industrial processes in which parts of the assembly line are no longer individual human beings, but individual human beings operating machinery, and sometimes machinery even operating further machinery as we go on into the late industrial age. So this transforms the world. We also see massive flooding of people from the countrysides into the cities, in part because the cities were where most of the jobs were, the manufacturing, and we see an incredible increase as well in poverty and human misery. So there's some really fascinating developments taking place because all this massive infrastructure and wealth and things continually being set in motion is happening, but at the same time it's becoming clear, in part because of better communications, just how miserable the lives of so many of the people who are playing a role in this actually are. And that's part of what Marx is responding to. One of the other things that's really important to keep in mind is that there were some really central political developments. The French Revolution, which I've talked about in several other videos, made a major impact in part by establishing the bourgeoisie as the ultimate ruling party, the people who were able to call the shots. And what we see happening in the move to the modern age is the decline of formerly privileged classes like kings or aristocracy or the landed gentry or the clergy. They end up losing status and position, not necessarily in terms of rank, but a lot of their rank becomes ceremonial. Where the real power lies is in the hands of the people who are able to generate and use and keep on developing further wealth. They're the ones who assume higher and higher status within society, and they're what we call the bourgeoisie. In England, this class was rising, and it led to some tensions between aristocrats and the new money, as we call it. In America, since there wasn't an aristocracy, it was a bourgeoisie really running the show from the beginning. And in France, the French Revolution swept away the previous class structure and said that it was trying to liberate the people, but the people turned out to be primarily the bourgeoisie, the people who owned, as we say, the means of production. So you see these classes vying for a position, and the bourgeoisie is rising to the top. In Germany, where Marx is coming from, and a place that he's very interested in, what's happening instead is while the bourgeoisie is rising, the nobility is still holding power, and there's tensions between them, and the proletariat are, the workers are increasing, but they're in a different power structure. So these developments mean an awful lot. Intellectually, Europe had become one vast network. There were regional characteristics, of course, and you can say that there were intellectual backwaters, but communications were vastly improving. different movements in philosophy are trickling into politics, into social life, into economics, and vice versa. Philosophers are taking account of that. The three, dominant countries as far as thinking, intellectual life goes, are that, triangle of England, or Great Britain rather, because that includes Scotland, where a lot was going on, France and Germany, with, the United States way off, across the Atlantic, and often importing ideas from England or Germany or France, and then reworking them into their own interesting forms. In philosophy, the German idealists were, you might say, the dominant philosophical movement in the early 19th century. But like most dominant movements, they end up splitting into all different, separate camps. And if you want a sort of thumbnail sketch about what was going on with German idealism and Hegelian philosophy, many of them are going to turn away from idealism and towards materialism, like Marx himself, who claims to have turned Hegel on his head. Hegel had thought that there was some sort of rational process that is running through history, a process of human development in which consciousness, moves from one step or one stage, one shape of consciousness to another. And it does so not by, everybody recognizing, oh, it's time to move, but rather by conflict, by the conflict of ideas born out sometimes even in violent strife, like the French Revolution. And there's a lot of experimentation that goes on involved in this because we can only see so far ahead. So the French revolutionaries, for example, thought that they were instituting a realm of absolute freedom against the unfreedom of the previous monarchy and its corruption. And it turns out that they were instituting something that leads to absolute terror as well. But that's an important stepping stone on the stage for development of humanity. And one thing that Hegel, so this is, the dialectical process as we call it, or as Hegel called it, involves, moving from stage to stage to stage through conflicts of ideas, conflicts of material forces that embody those ideas against each other, leading to greater and greater syntheses, as Hegel called them. Now, there were a number of radical Hegelians, Marx among them, who took parts of Hegel's thought and then said, he was right about that, but he's totally wrong about this, and now we need to rethink this. So Hegel, for example, had thought that religion was something very important in the development of human beings, that we didn't want to get away from religion, but we wanted to sort of turn religion into something like philosophy. Religion was the penultimate stage in the dialectical development towards absolute knowing. Marx and Feuerbach before him say, no, religion is actually something that's detrimental to human beings. Feuerbach would talk about it as a sign of our own alienation from ourselves, that we project these ideas, these religious ideas out there, and we give them power, and we lose ourselves in the process. Marx will actually go so far as to call religion the opiate of the masses. And by that, he doesn't just mean that they sit around smoking opium all day, feeling good and getting high. What he means is it's a palliative for suffering that doesn't actually address the causes of suffering. It comes out of human suffering. As a response, it leaves the suffering in place. And so Marx is drawing upon a notion of philosophy that he's getting from Hegel, but he's radically transforming it in the process. He's interested in thinking about the whole of things, the entire system, and how all of the parts fit together. That's very typically Hegelian. He's also interested in watching how these processes develop and trying to get a step ahead and figure out which side of history we need to be on. There was also an incredible emphasis at that time on what we call political economy. Nowadays we often call this policy making or economic theory or political theory. And the idea was that by getting the right idea about how things like property or the laws of supply and demand or how markets work, we could start to improve the human condition. And so people like Adam Smith would be, a central person in political economy. Smith is somebody who Marx actually spent a lot of time studying. And Marx is a student of political economy. He's very interested in it, but he thinks that it doesn't go deep enough into figuring out what's really going on. So in terms of the themes of our class, it doesn't get to the underlying realities that prop up political economy. There were also some really interesting initiatives going on. You can see this reflected in the Communist Manifesto and its discussion of these in what we nowadays call social theory or social thought. There was quite a bit of reformist and utopian social thought being proposed, particularly in England and particularly in France. And Marx spent a lot of time reading people like Charles Fourier or Saint-Simon. These were people who were proposing new kinds of ways of understanding society, and along with them ways to transform the human being so that we would eliminate class conflict and poverty and injustice and inequalities. Marx actually came into contact with some of the people who were involved in certain of these movements, like the English Chartists. Now, Marx is kind of an interesting character. I want to fit him into this history itself, in part because he is an international agent of the revolution, you might say. He starts out in Germany, and he's going to move to France, to Paris, and he's going to spend a little bit of time in Brussels, and then he's going to be in France and then in London. So he's inhabiting the key three centers of European economics, European politics, the European life as it's developing in the mid-19th century to the late 19th century. Germany, France, England. Not to say that other places didn't matter, but those were the places where the greatest initiative for changing things was occurring. He wanted to, it looks like, have an academic career at first, but he wasn't able to do so, in part because there was a sort of policy against allowing people into academic posts in the state that he was in who had liberal or radical views, and Marx did. So a lot of the young Hegelians or the radical Hegelians couldn't get teaching posts because of that. And so Marx ends up going into journalism. And that's indeed how he made a good bit of the money that he made during his lifetime, was by working as a journalist for a lot of papers, including one based in New York. Never made a ton of money. He actually lived in poverty a good part of the time. Some of his children died young because of that. It's kind of a sad story, but he was committed to living among the working class and thinking out the responses to what was going on and happening to the working class in modern industrial society. Now, one other thing that I do have to mention that is happening after these two texts are written, but is a very important part of the story, is the revolutions of 1848. 1848 was a year in which these uprisings are taking place. And, when we talk about revolutions, and we're thinking about, thinking back to earlier ones like the American Revolution or the French Revolution, the idea was that people were, not just rising up in arms and saying, I've had it, I can't take it anymore. That's a revolt. A revolution attempts to put a new state of affairs into place, to change the fabric of society. So the American Revolution tried to break America as a colony off from the British colonial power and send America off on its own course. The French Revolution, in many respects even more radical, tried to tear out the first two estates, clergy and nobility, from the French nation and elevate the third estate, the people, into the positions of power. The revolutions that are taking place in Germany, primarily, in 1848, but in a few other places as well, are going to aim at expanding human freedom. And there's a lot of different initiatives going on. Marx takes account of that. It's going to have massive effects. People in Russia are going to crack down after the revolutions happening over in Europe, sending people like, say, Dostoevsky to Siberia as a result. There's a whole complicated story there. But the point is, the sort of tensions, the sort of underlying conflicts that are being discussed came to a critical juncture point, a crisis, in 1848, and we see further things going on and on after that throughout the rest of the century. And Marx is at the heart of quite a few of those. The communists play a major role. They're not the only people on the left. They're not the only people working for revolutions. There are also anarchists and various syndicalists. But Marx's ideas, along with Engels, played a major role in shaping where history was going to go. Let's talk now about some of the key themes that are going to keep on coming up that you want to keep an eye out for and try to at least have a good solid understanding of by the time that we're finished with this section. So these are arranged in kind of a constellation. I'm not going to say that one of them is necessarily more important than the other, because they're all kind of connected with each other. The first of them that I would bring up is this notion of social classes. So for Marx, human beings and their consciousness, their way of understanding themselves, their way of being in the world, is determined in large part by how they live, and that's determined by what social class they belong to. Among the social classes, we should distinguish two of them as particularly important to make sense out of. One of them is what we call the bourgeoisie. These come from the original townspeople, the burghers in medieval towns, and eventually become the dominant power, the dominant social class within modern industrial society, taking the other elite classes and either absorbing them or pushing them away, destroying the means of their power and influence, and eventually dominating the world. The other class that's particularly important to think about is what's called the proletariat. And the proletariat, that's not a word that's original to Marx. It was used by the Romans to talk about people who were so dirt poor that the only thing that they had to contribute to society was making more babies, proles. And Marx thinks that in modern industrial society, the vast majority of people are forced into a position of that sort of poverty, where they don't have opportunities. There's really, the whole system is rigged against them, and they're unable to accumulate wealth or to put it to work, and they're compelled to have to work in order to live. So those are two important classes. Another key idea is the conflict between social classes as something that drives the historical situation that we're in, that explains why things are the way that they are. Social classes are involved in relations in which one social class exploits another social class, and that leads to tensions and conflict. Another key idea is that of alienation or estrangement, in German Entfremdung. And this means a state of losing something of yourself, of having something of yourself taken away, or seeing it out there as something standing against you, and feeling that, not just thinking about that, not just realizing that's the situation you're in, but feeling it to your bones, in your heart. Another key idea that is closely connected with this is that of human nature as fundamentally tied in with creation and production, with work, with labor. Along with this goes the key idea or key theme of the centrality of economics. Marx believes that human beings are fundamentally economic creatures. That is, creatures involved in production, in exchange, in consumption, and that's what really drives everything. He calls that the basis. Politics, law, philosophy, culture, all these other things are driven by what's happening in people's economic lives and not the other way around, according to him. Another key idea that goes along with this would be the struggle between what we call capital and labor. And capital is something that the bourgeoisie are able to accumulate and use to consolidate and further their position. And it takes in labor. It's the effect of labor that other people have done, and it's been appropriated, taken away from them. They've only been given wages in return, and the capital is then reinvested into the whole system to sort of make the situation of the bourgeois stronger and stronger, making the situation of the laborers or the proletariat weaker and weaker. Another key idea is that capitalism or industrial society necessarily goes through crises in which many people are put out of work, and there's overproduction, which leads to an economic collapse, misery on a grand scale, and that capitalism in its own, or on its own terms, is unable to actually prevent these crises from happening. This is something intrinsic to the nature of the capitalist economy, according to Marx. Another key idea would be that of communism as a program. Communism is the proposal that Marx and Engels have for how to make things better for the working class, instead of just trying to reform things, instead of trying to improve their position by raising wages. The communists say that the proletariat has to take power, political power, take over the state, and therefore take over the means of production as well. And this leads us to another key idea of the communists, one of the ones that's probably the most controversial, which is that private property as we know it, as we understand it in terms of bourgeois private property, needs to be abolished and replaced by social property or state-owned property. There's a lot to be said about this, but we'll talk about that more in some of the other videos. Finally, one of the other key themes is that of what we call ideology. And ideology is a set of ideas, so it's a connected set of ideas, a logi, logos of those, that represents the perspective or the interests of a particular class at a particular time, but it's viewed by them as being universal, eternal, good for all human beings. And so there's a kind of masking that's going on of the real situation. Ideology purports to tell us the way things really are, but it actually conceals the way things truly are. And it ends up reflecting a kind of false consciousness. And it's very difficult to combat, but that's part of what the Marxists are attempting to do, is to critique ideology. So those are the key themes to keep in mind as we go through this work. One last thing that I would say, particularly with this guy, there's a lot of historical baggage associated with Marx. And so if you approach it saying, I don't want to learn anything because I know this guy's just a dirty communist or a socialist, and those guys are all bad, they want to take away everything including my toothbrush, you're probably not going to get much out of reading the work. This is one of those cases where you probably want to put aside whatever preconceived ideas you have so you can read the text and see what the text is actually saying. And then if you find yourself disagreeing with the text afterwards, after you fully understood it, that's perfectly fine.